In the year 1250, on a beach in southern Lebanon, 25 men were buried in a hurry. No coffins, no names, just bodies stacked into a pit and set on fire. Archaeologists who found the site centuries later could tell, just from the bones, that these men had died violently. Skulls fractured by blunt weapons, one head found separated from its body, possibly displayed as a warning. European-style shoe buckles and coins were scattered among the remains. For 700 years, that was all anyone knew about who they were. Then, in 2019, a team of geneticists cracked open 9 of those skeletons and read something no chronicle had ever recorded: their DNA. And what it showed, it didn't match the story most people think they know about the Crusades. It matched something stranger, and it's the key to understanding a much bigger claim currently spreading across the internet. Right now, there are lists circulating with titles like 20 surnames that prove you're descended from Crusader knights. Percy, Neville, Mortimer, Sinclair, Bruce, Douglas, Fitzgerald, Montgomery, Talbot, Courtney. If your last name is on one of these lists, the claim is simple. Your blood carries something special, something that survived 900 years, all the way from a battlefield in the Holy Land to your living room today. It's a great story. The question is whether it's actually true. And to answer that, we need to go through 3 completely different bodies of evidence: real medieval history, real Y-chromosome genetics, and a branch of mathematics that most people have never heard of, but which ends up being the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Here's the first thing almost nobody tells you before selling you a surname list. A surname is not a gene. It doesn't sit on a chromosome. It's a piece of paper, a legal and cultural label that started getting fixed onto families roughly 800 to 900 years ago in Western Europe, right around the time the Crusades themselves were happening. And paper can lie in ways that DNA cannot. So the real question isn't, does this surname prove Crusader ancestry? The real question is, what can genetics actually tell us about a bloodline that old? And does the answer live up to the myth? Or does it replace the myth with something the surname lists never mention at all? Let's start with what people used to believe, because for most of modern history, this wasn't even something you could test. It was something you simply asserted. For centuries, a family's connection to the Crusades, or to Norman nobility more broadly, was proven with a coat of arms, a name that sounded French, or an old parchment supposedly listing the noble families who fought alongside a king or a duke. People believed it because there was no way to check it. The most famous example is a document called the Battle Abbey Roll, a list first published in the 1500s, claiming to record the noble families who crossed to England with William the Conqueror in 1066, the same military and cultural class that would go on to supply many of the Crusades' most famous leaders 2 generations later. Victorian genealogists used this roll to link hundreds of British surnames to a prestigious Norman origin, and in 1889, the Duchess of Cleveland published a 3-volume set of family histories built directly on top of it. There was just one problem. When historians actually traced the roll's history, they found it had been copied, recopied, and quietly expanded for 300 years, with families added who, according to independent historical records, hadn't even arrived in England until generations after the conquest. The historian Sir Egerton Bridges called it a disgusting forgery. The historian E.A. Freeman dismissed it outright as a transparent fiction. When the genealogist J. Horace Round conducted a rigorous review in 1901, he confirmed what critics had long suspected. The roll wasn't a contemporary record at all, but most likely a 14th century compilation, edited and re-edited by generations of monks and heralds with their own families' prestige in mind. Modern historians who have cross-checked it against independent sources, like the Domesday Book and a separate list assembled from church records at Dives-sur-Mer in Normandy, conclude that only around 15 names on the entire roll can actually be verified as genuine companions of the conqueror. That matters here for a simple reason. The same culture of inflated, aspirational genealogy that produced the Battle Abbey Roll is exactly the culture that later produced lists of Crusader families in the 1800s and 1900s. Many of these lists were compiled backward from a surname's existing prestige, not forward from actual evidence, which means before we even get to DNA, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Some of these lists were never really about ancestry. They were about status. So does that mean the whole idea is nonsense? Not quite, because some of these families are extremely well documented, and their crusading history isn't myth. It's recorded fact, verifiable through charters, chronicles, and independent medieval sources. Take the House of Lusignan, a family from Poitou in western France who didn't just fight in a crusade, they ruled one of its greatest prizes. Guy de Lusignan became king of Jerusalem in the 1180s through his marriage to Queen Sibylla, and after Jerusalem fell in 1187, his family went on to rule the island of Cyprus for nearly 300 years. Take the Montfort family. Simon de Montfort led military campaigns against heretical movements in southern France in the early 1200s, in what's known as the Albigensian Crusade, and his descendants later fought in England's civil wars. Take the Courtenay family. A branch of this same house produced Peter II of Courtenay, who briefly ruled as Latin Emperor of Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade, diverted from the Holy Land and sacked the Byzantine capital in 1204. And take the Douglas family of Scotland. After Robert the Bruce died in 1329, his closest companion, Sir James Douglas, carried Bruce's embalmed heart in a silver casket, intending to bear it to Jerusalem, only to be killed fighting Moorish forces in southern Spain along the way. These aren't Victorian inventions. These are events historians can point to in independent charters and chronicles. So we have two very different categories hiding inside the same clickbait list. Families with real document-backed crusading history and families whose Crusader connection is really just a rebranded coat of arms from a 19th century vanity book. And even for the genuinely documented families, there's still a much bigger scientific problem waiting, one that has nothing to do with which list you trust. Here's the scientific question underneath all of this. Even if a family genuinely fought in the Crusades 8 or 9 centuries ago, can a DNA test today actually detect that? To answer that, you need to understand what a DNA test can and can't see. Most consumer ancestry tests read your autosomal DNA, the 22 paired chromosomes you inherit roughly half from each parent. Autosomal DNA is powerful for finding relatives within the last few generations because those shared chunks, measured in units called centimorgans, are still long and identifiable. But every generation, recombination shuffles and halves what gets passed down, and by pure chance, whole chunks get dropped entirely. Go back 30 generations to roughly the time of the Crusades, and the mathematically expected genetic contribution from any single one of your ancestors. That far back is a fraction so small it is often not statistically detectable in a modern genome at all, even though that person remains, genealogically, unquestionably your ancestor. There's one part of the genome that behaves completely differently, though, the Y-chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son for as long as the unbroken male line continues. And because European surnames historically were also passed from father to son, geneticists realized something clever in the early 2000s. If surnames and Y-chromosomes travel down the same path, generation after generation, then men sharing a surname today should, in theory, share a Y-DNA signature too. This is where the actual science of surname genetics comes from, and it's worth walking through in detail because it's genuinely fascinating, and it comes with a very important asterisk. The pioneering study, published in 2000 by Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes and colleague Catherine Irvin, tested a randomly selected group of men who all shared his own surname, Sykes. The result was striking. Nearly half of the sample carried a nearly identical Y-chromosome type, one that had never turned up in control samples from the same region or the wider United Kingdom. That pattern is exactly what you'd expect if all those men descended from a single founder, living around the time the surname was first adopted roughly 20 generations ago. Researchers Turi King and Mark Jobling then expanded this into a much larger study, testing over 1,600 Y-chromosome samples across 40 different British surnames. And this is where the story gets more complicated and more honest. On average, only around 62% of men sharing a surname also shared a common Y-chromosome lineage traceable to one ancestral cluster. For some rare surnames, that figure climbed as high as 87%. For other, more common surnames, it fell close to zero. The name had clearly been adopted independently by many unrelated families at different times and places. Rarer surnames, the researchers found, consistently showed stronger genetic clustering, because a rare name is more likely to trace back to one small founding family rather than dozens of unconnected ones. A separate independent research team led by Brian McAvoy and Daniel Bradley ran a comparable study on Irish surnames and found the pattern held there too, but was, if anything, even messier. Looking specifically at Gaelic Irish surnames, McAvoy and Bradley reported that not one of the names they tested showed more than about half of its current bearers descending from a single common ancestor. The same research group did find one striking outlier in a related study. Analyzing Y chromosomes across northwestern Ireland, they discovered that roughly 1 in 5 men sampled in that region carried a single, distinctive genetic signature strongly associated with surnames traditionally linked to the medieval Uí-Néill dynasty, the same dynasty that produced the legendary High King Niall of the 9 hostages. That is a real, published, statistically significant genetic signature tied to a specific medieval Irish lineage. It's also the exception, not the rule. Most surnames tested, in Ireland and Britain alike, show nothing nearly that clean. Why the gap between a case like the Uí-Néill and an average surname? Because a surname's genetic thread can be broken in ways that have nothing to do with biology and everything to do with ordinary human life. A child raised by a stepfather who took his name, a formal or informal adoption, an illegitimate birth recorded under the mother's family name, and The fact that researchers politely call a non-paternity event, where the recorded legal father wasn't the biological one. Across a genealogy spanning 900 years and roughly 30 generations, even a small, consistent rate of these events compounds dramatically. King and Jobling's own analysis of the original Sykes data estimated that rate at around 1.3% per generation, a number that sounds almost negligible on its own until you multiply its effect across 30 generations of a family tree. There's also a technical wrinkle worth knowing if you ever take one of these tests yourself. Not all Y-DNA tests have the same resolving power. The earliest surname studies, including the original Sykes research, used a small handful of fast mutating markers called Y-STRs, which can show that two men are probably related, but can't precisely date how far back. Later studies added slower, more stable markers called Y-SNPs, which sharpen the picture but still can't tell you, on their own, whether two men's most recent shared ancestor lived 300 years ago or 900. Add to that the fact that certain Y-chromosome haplogroups, like R1b, the single most common paternal lineage across most of Western Europe, are carried by tens of millions of unrelated men today. And you can see the problem. A match at a low resolution might mean two men are close relations, or it might just mean they both belong to one of the most common lineages on the continent, inherited from separate ancestors thousands of years before any surname existed at all. So even in the best documented, most reliable studies, using real, tested Y-DNA, not folklore, a shared surname is evidence of shared ancestry. It is not proof of it. And that's before we even get to the biggest twist in this entire story. What actually happened to the DNA of the Crusaders themselves, out in the field, where the history actually took place. This is where that beach in Lebanon comes back in. In 2019, a team led by geneticist Mark Haber at the Wellcome Sanger Institute in the UK sequenced whole genomes from 9 of those 13th century skeletons found in the mass grave near Sidon. Men archaeologists had identified as Crusaders based on the burial site, their battle wounds, and the European-style artifacts buried alongside them. The team compared their genomes to both ancient and modern populations from across Europe and the Near East, and for comparison, also sequenced DNA from 4 people who had lived in the same region roughly 1,000 years earlier during the Roman period. The results, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, gave researchers something no surname list ever could: a direct genetic snapshot of the Crusades themselves, sampled straight from the men who fought in them. Of the 9 individuals, 3 were genetically European. 2 of those 3 clustered most closely with modern Spanish populations, showing affinities to the Basque region, France, and northern Italy. The 3rd was closest to modern Sardinians, a detail that fits neatly with the historical record, since men from Iberia, France, and Italy made up a large share of the Crusader armies that passed through the Near East. 4 of the 9 men were genetically Near Eastern, evidence that local populations were being actively recruited into the Crusader forces, rather than simply opposing them. And 2 individuals showed clearly mixed genetic ancestry, direct genomic evidence of children born from relationships between European Crusaders and local Near Eastern women, most likely in the decades after the first waves of Crusaders had already settled in the region. For a moment, that sounds like it confirms the myth: European blood arriving in a new land, mixing, and creating a lasting new bloodline. But then the researchers checked something crucial. Did that Crusader genetic signature persist? Does it show up in the DNA of modern Lebanese populations today, nearly 800 years later? It essentially doesn't. The study's authors described the Crusaders' genetic influence on the region as a transient pulse, a temporary ripple that appeared, mixed briefly into the local population for a generation or two, and then was diluted back out almost entirely. When the team compared modern Lebanese genomes to their ancient samples, they found that people living in Lebanon today, Christians in particular, are genetically far more similar to the Roman period population that lived there 4 centuries before the Crusades even began than they are to the Crusaders who arrived in the 1200s. As Haber put it in comments to the press at the time, if you simply looked at the genetics of people from the Roman period stacked next to people living in the region today, you would think that there was just this continuity, as if 13th century Europe had barely touched the region's genetic makeup at all. Some researchers have suggested this rapid fade-out likely reflects the fact that within a century of the Crusader states being established, sustained military campaigns pushed most of the European settler population back out of the region entirely. Read that again, because it's the opposite of what the clickbait titles promise. Even real, confirmed genetically sequenced Crusaders, men buried with their weapons, killed in an actual documented battle, left behind a genetic signal that mostly evaporated within a couple of generations, swallowed by the much larger population around it. So, if even direct descendants living in the exact region the Crusaders invaded lost that signal that fast, What hope does a surname sitting on a list from a Victorian genealogy book have of proving a true bloodline 900 years later on the opposite side of a continent? And yet, and this is the turn in the story that almost nobody making these videos ever gets to, the real science doesn't leave you empty-handed. It replaces a fake, exclusive specialness with something arguably far more remarkable. And it comes from a completely different branch of research, not genetics at all, but the mathematics of genealogy itself. Think about how a family tree actually grows, moving backward. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. By the time you go back just 10 generations, roughly 300 years, the math already demands over 1,000 ancestral slots in your tree. Go back 30 generations to the time of the Crusades, and the number of slots explodes past 1 billion. But there weren't 1 billion people alive in medieval Europe. There were only a few million. The only way to resolve that contradiction is if the same real people occupy many of those slots at once, appearing in your family tree over and over again through completely different lines. Distant cousins unknowingly marrying distant cousins across dozens of generations. Statisticians call this pedigree collapse, and in 1999, Yale statistician Joseph Chang built a mathematical model of exactly what it means at the scale of an entire population. His work was extended in 2004 by researchers Douglas Rode, Steve Olson, and Chang in a paper published in the journal Nature, and their conclusion was almost hard to believe. Trace the ancestry of any 2 people with long-standing European heritage back far enough, and you don't find separate, unrelated lines forever branching apart. You find that they converge. According to their model, the most recent common ancestor of nearly everyone with substantial European ancestry alive today lived only around 600 years ago, sometime near the end of the 13th century. Go back further, to roughly the year 1000, and something even stranger falls out of the same model. The researchers calculated that of all the adults living in Europe at that time who left any surviving descendants at all, essentially every single one of them is a direct ancestor of essentially every European alive today. Around 1 in 5 adults living in Europe around the year 1000 left no descendants at all who survive today. Their family lines simply died out. But the remaining, roughly 80%, aren't the ancestors of some Europeans. According to the model, they are mathematically ancestors of nearly all of them. This isn't only a theoretical exercise sitting in a statistics journal. In 2013, geneticists Peter Ralph and Graham Coop tested the underlying idea against real genetic data drawn from more than 2,000 people across Europe, published in the journal PLOS Biology. They found the genealogical signal in actual DNA was consistent with the mathematical model. Even people sampled from opposite ends of the continent with no known family connection share many thousands of common genealogical ancestors within roughly the last 1,000 years. Which means this: if a real crusading family from the year 1200, a Lusignan, a Montfort, a Douglas, has any descendants alive today at all, and if you have substantial, long-standing European ancestry yourself, the math says you are almost certainly one of them. Not through one single, fragile, easily broken surname line, vulnerable to a single adoption or a single non-paternity event 9 centuries ago. Through thousands of overlapping lines simultaneously, most of which no paper record will ever let you trace, running through the entire tangled, interwoven genealogy of medieval Europe. That is what the surname lists get backwards. They tell you that a true bloodline is rare, that it belongs to 20 special families, and that you need the right last name printed on your passport to claim it. The actual science says close to the opposite. Deep ancestral connection to medieval nobility, crusading knights very much included, isn't a rare inheritance reserved for people whose surname happens to survive on a list. For the overwhelming majority of people with deep European ancestry, it's close to unavoidable. So where does that leave the 20 names circulating on those lists? The Percys, the Nevilles, the Mortimers, the Sinclairs, the Fitzgeralds, the Grosvenors, the Curzons, the Bruces? Some of them genuinely trace to documented medieval nobility, families whose crusading activity shows up in independent historical records, not just heraldic guesswork stitched together centuries later. A shared surname with one of these families is a real historical clue worth investigating on its own merits. A lead for a genealogist. And if you're a male carrying the name, a testable Y-DNA hypothesis, imperfect but far from meaningless, the same way the King and Jobling and McEvoy and Bradley studies show real, if partial, genetic co-ancestry clustering around genuine surnames. What it is not, and what honest, peer-reviewed science has never claimed it to be, is proof of a unique genetic mark that separates the people carrying that surname from everyone else. The Crusader ancient DNA study out of Sidon showed that even confirmed sequenced Crusader DNA, mixed directly into a local population at the time, was mostly gone within a few generations. And the mathematics of European genealogy, tested against real genetic data, shows that the deep, tangled connection to that era doesn't run through a chosen few families at all. It runs through nearly everyone. The myth promised you a secret bloodline hiding in your last name, one that 99% of people simply don't have access to. What the evidence actually hands you instead is stranger, and in its own way, far more generous. A family tree so vast, so repeatedly folded back in on itself, that the knights of the Crusades, the peasants who never left their villages, the merchants, the monks, and the mothers whose names were never recorded on any parchment at all, they're very likely all in there, tangled together across 10,000 overlapping lines, all belonging to you, whether your surname happens to say so or not.